The dust had barely settled on the auction platform when Violet Morgan realized her entire future was about to be decided by strangers who saw her as nothing more than property. And the irony was not lost on her that the very skills her mother had lovingly taught her in their Pennsylvania kitchen would now be the chains that bound her fate. The September sun beat down mercilessly on Knights Ferry, California, in 1867, turning the wooden platform into a griddle that burned through the thin soles of her worn boots. Violet stood with her shoulders straight despite everything, her dark auburn hair pinned back severely under a faded bonnet, her green eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd of rough miners, ranchers, and businessmen who had gathered to bid on the indentured servants being sold to pay off various debts. She was 22 years old, and this was not how she had imagined her life would unfold when she had left Pennsylvania 6 months ago with promises of honest work and a fresh start in California. The auctioneer, a portly man with sweat stains spreading across his vest, droned on about her qualifications. She had been working at the Golden Rose Hotel when the owner died suddenly, leaving debts that his widow could not pay. The creditors had seized everything, including the contracts of the workers, and now Violet found herself here, being sold like livestock because she had signed an employment contract that included a clause about debt assumption. The words felt hollow in her ears as the man listed her abilities as though reading from a menu. This here is Miss Violet Morgan, gentlemen. 22 years of age, good health, all her teeth. But what makes this one special is her cooking. Trained by her mother, who ran a boarding house back east. Can make bread that melts in your mouth, pies that would make your grandmother weep with envy, roasts that fall off the bone. She can stretch supplies when times are lean and create feasts when you have plenty. Can preserve, pickle, smoke meats, and manage a kitchen besides. The widow has her contract papers here, showing 3 more years of service owed. Whoever takes her gets a cook better than you will find in San Francisco. I guarantee it. Violet felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Around her, several other servants waited their turn, all of them trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The mining town of Knights Ferry had grown rapidly along the Stanislaus River, and with growth came opportunity for some and desperation for others. She belonged to the latter category now. The bidding started low. A grizzled miner with a long beard offered $50, clearly looking for someone to cook for his claim crew. A saloon owner countered with $75, probably wanting to improve his establishment's reputation. The numbers climbed slowly while Violet tried to keep her breathing steady. Each bid felt like a nail in a coffin, sealing her fate into a future she had no say in choosing. Then a new voice cut through the others, strong and clear. $500. The crowd went quiet. Violet's eyes snapped to the speaker, finding him immediately because everyone else had turned to stare as well. He stood at the back of the gathering, tall and lean in dusty trail clothes, a worn hat shading his face. Even from a distance, she could see he was younger than most of the other bidders, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. He moved forward through the crowd, which parted for him, and as he came closer, Violet saw his eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. $500, he repeated, his voice carrying easily. Cash. The auctioneer's eyes widened with greedy delight. Well now, that is a generous bid, Mr. Nathaniel. Any counters? The saloon owner shook his head and stepped back. The miner spat tobacco juice and walked away, muttering. No one else seemed inclined to match such an amount. $500 was more than most men in Knights Ferry made in half a year of hard labor. Going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Ashton Nathaniel for $500. The auctioneer banged his gavel, and Violet felt her knees weaken. She locked them, refusing to show any more vulnerability than she already had. The cowboy named Ashton Nathaniel approached the platform, reaching into his jacket to pull out a leather wallet. He counted out the bills with careful precision, handing them to the auctioneer, who verified each one with the scrutiny of a man who trusted no one. Her papers, if you please, Ashton said. The auctioneer handed over a fold of documents, which Ashton tucked into his jacket without looking at them. Then he turned to Violet, and she found herself looking into those gray-blue eyes for the first time at close range. There was something in them she had not expected, something that looked almost like kindness, though she warned herself not to trust first impressions. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Miss Morgan, he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "If you will come with me, please." It was not really a request, not when he owned her contract now, but his tone was respectful. Violet descended the platform steps on shaking legs, her small bundle of possessions clutched to her chest. Everything she owned in the world fit into a cloth sack no bigger than a feed bag. Ashton gestured for her to walk beside him, not behind, which surprised her. They moved through the dispersing crowd, receiving curious glances and a few knowing smirks that made Violet's stomach turn. They walked in silence down the main street of Knight's Ferry, past the assay office and the general store, past the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil created a steady rhythm. The town sat in a valley with rolling hills rising on either side, covered in golden grass that shimmered in the afternoon heat. The Stanislaus River ran nearby, its presence marked by a line of cottonwood trees that provided the only real shade for miles. Ashton led her to a horse tied outside the general store, a handsome bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor. He untied the reins and then paused, looking at Violet directly. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Some," Violet admitted. "It has been a while." He nodded and swung into the saddle with easy grace, then extended his hand down to her. "Put your foot on mine and give me your hand. I will pull you up." Violet hesitated only a moment before complying. His hand was strong and calloused, his grip firm as he lifted her, as though she weighed nothing at all. She settled behind the saddle, trying to figure out where to put her hands, acutely aware of how improper this all was and how little that mattered now. "You can hold on to the saddle rim or on to me," Ashton said without looking back. "Whatever makes you comfortable. It is about an hour's ride to my ranch." Violet gripped the back of the saddle, her bundle wedged between them. Ashton clicked his tongue, and the horse started moving at an easy walk that gradually increased to a gentle trot once they left the town behind. The rhythm was surprisingly soothing, and Violet found herself relaxing slightly despite her circumstances. The land opened up before them, vast and golden under the September sun, mountains visible in the hazy distance. After they had ridden for perhaps 20 minutes, Ashton spoke again. "I suppose you have questions." Violet had hundreds of questions, but she chose the most important one. "What exactly do you expect from me?" "The truth, I need a cook. My ranch hands have been complaining about the food for months, and I cannot blame them, because I am the one doing the cooking and I am terrible at it. We eat a lot of burnt beans and tough beef. A man came through last week and mentioned the auction, said there was a cook being sold. I had not planned to attend, but then I thought about eating another one of my own meals and decided to take a chance." His tone was matter-of-fact, almost self-deprecating. Violet studied the back of his head, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, the straight line of his shoulders. $500 is a lot of money for someone to cook beans. It is, but I figured if you were as good as the auctioneer claimed, it would be worth it. And if you were not, well, I had the money to spare, and you needed help. Something in the way he said it made Violet's throat tighten. "I do not need charity." "Good, because I am not offering it. I am offering a job. You cook for me and my men 3 meals a day, and in return, you get room, board, and wages. I thought you bought my contract." "I did." The horse splashed through a shallow creek, the water sparkling in the sunlight. On the other side, Ashton brought the animal to a stop and twisted in the saddle to look back at her. "Miss Morgan, I bought your contract so I could do this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the fold of papers the auctioneer had given him. Before Violet could react, he tore them in half, then in half again, and scattered the pieces to the wind. They fluttered away like strange birds, disappearing into the golden grass. Violet stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "What did you just do?" "I set you free. You do not owe anyone anything. Not me, not anyone else. You are free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." "But you paid $500. "I did, and it was worth it to know that one less person is trapped in a situation they did not choose." He turned back around, and the horse started moving again. "That said, I meant what I said about needing a cook. If you want the job, it is yours. I pay $40 a month plus room and board. You would have your own cabin, privacy, and respect from every man on the ranch. Or they will answer to me. But it is your choice. If you want to go somewhere else, I will take you back to town or to Sacramento, wherever you need to go. No strings attached." Violet could not speak for a long moment. The magnitude of what he had just done, The casual way he had torn up papers worth $500 and freed her without asking for anything in return left her speechless. She had been so certain of what her future held, so resigned to whatever fate awaited her at the end of this ride, and now suddenly all of that had changed. Why? She finally managed to ask. Why would you do that? Ashton was quiet for several strides of the horse. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more personal. 5 years ago, my sister found herself in a bad situation. She had signed a contract to work as a governess, but the family turned out to be cruel. They worked her half to death, barely fed her, and when she tried to leave, they threatened to have her arrested for breach of contract. She had no money, no way out. A stranger helped her, paid off what she supposedly owed, and asked for nothing in return. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. My sister made it home, and eventually she married a good man, and now she has a family of her own. But if that stranger had not helped her, I do not know what would have happened. He adjusted his hat against the sun. I made a promise to myself that if I ever had the means to do the same for someone else, I would. Today I had the means, so I did it. Violet felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had been alone for so long, fighting so hard just to survive, that kindness felt like a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything. Just think about my offer. You can give me your answer when we get to the ranch. If you decide to leave, I will make sure you get wherever you need to go safely. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, less fraught with tension and more filled with possibility. Violet's mind raced, turning over everything he had said, examining it for traps or hidden meanings. But the more she thought about it, the more she came back to the simple truth that he had freed her without asking for anything first. He had taken her at her word that she would think about his offer, trusted her not to simply run off the moment his back was turned. The Nathaniel Ranch appeared gradually, emerging from the landscape like something that had always belonged there. A main house stood on a slight rise, built of timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Surrounding it were various outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, corrals with horses and cattle visible in the distance. A vegetable garden stretched out behind the main house, looking somewhat neglected but still producing. It was clearly a working ranch, prosperous but not ostentatious, built for function rather than show. Ashton rode straight to the barn, where a lanky young man with straw-colored hair came out to greet them. His eyes widened when he saw Violet, and he shot Ashton a questioning look. "Billy, this is Miss Violet Morgan. She might be our new cook if she decides to take the job. Miss Morgan, this is Billy Cooper, one of my ranch hands." Billy touched his hat respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, miss, and if you do decide to cook for us, we would be mighty grateful. No offense to the boss, but his cooking could double as leather tanning solution." Despite everything, Violet felt a smile tug at her lips. Ashton dismounted and helped her down, his hand steady on her waist as she slid to the ground. Her legs felt wobbly after the ride, and she took a moment to get her balance. "Billy, can you take care of Thunder? I am going to show Miss Morgan around." "Sure thing, boss." Ashton gestured for Violet to follow him, and they walked toward a small cabin set slightly apart from the other buildings. It was modest, but well-maintained, with a stone chimney and glass windows, which were a luxury in these parts. He opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. The interior was simple but clean. A bed frame with a straw mattress stood in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs in the center, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and shelves built into the walls. A rag rug covered part of the plank floor, and curtains hung at the windows. It was sparse, but it was also private and safe, and after months of sharing cramped quarters with other hotel workers, it looked like a palace to Violet. "It is not much," Ashton said, standing in the doorway. "But it is yours if you want it. The bunkhouse has a pump out front with good water. The main house has the kitchen, which is where you would be working most of the time. I have 5 ranch hands, including Billy, plus myself. That is 6 men total. We eat breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, and supper after the work is done, usually around 7. Sundays we usually just have 2 meals, brunch and supper, since it is a day of rest." Violet walked slowly around the cabin, running her hand along the table, testing the sturdiness of the chair. "You said $40 a month?" "That is right, paid at the end of each month. If you need supplies for the kitchen, you tell me, and I will get them. If you need anything personal, you can go into town whenever you want. Like I said, you are free to come and go as you please." She turned to face him, this stranger who had upended her entire world in the span of an hour. He stood backlit by the afternoon sun, his face shadowed but his posture relaxed, patient, waiting for her decision without pressuring her. The truth was, Violet had nowhere else to go. She had no family left in Pennsylvania, no friends in California except for a few other hotel workers who were in the same desperate situation she had been in. She had less than $2 to her name, no prospects, and winter would be coming in a few months. She could take what little money she had and try to make her way to Sacramento or San Francisco, but what would she do when she got there? End up in another situation just like the one she had escaped from, most likely. But beyond the practical considerations, something about Ashton Nathaniel made her want to stay. Maybe it was the way he had freed her without hesitation, or the quiet respect in his voice when he spoke to her, or the fact that he had shared something personal about his sister to explain his actions. Maybe it was simply that he had given her a choice when no one else had. "I will stay," she said. "I will take the job." Something that might have been relief crossed his face. "I am glad, truly. But I need to see the kitchen before I can promise miracles. If your supplies are as bad as your cooking, we might have problems." The corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "Fair enough. Do you want to rest first, or would you like to see it now?" "Now, please. If I am going to cook supper tonight, I need to know what I am working with." They walked together to the main house, and Ashton led her through the front door into a large main room that served as both living area and dining space. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a long wooden table that could easily seat 10 people occupied the center of the room. The furniture was rough-hewn, but well-made, and everything was tidy if not exactly clean. It had the feeling of a space maintained by men who did their best, but lacked a woman's touch. The kitchen was through a doorway at the back. It was larger than Violet had expected, with a good iron stove, a deep sink with a pump handle, and plenty of counter space. Shelves lined the walls, holding a mix of supplies, dishes, and cooking implements. Violet began opening cupboards and inspecting what was available, her mind already cataloging and planning. Ashton watched her from the doorway. "Is it workable?" "It is better than workable. This is a good kitchen." She found a bin of flour, checked its freshness, nodded approval. "You have decent supplies here. They are not organized well, but that can be fixed. Do you have a smokehouse?" "Yes, and a root cellar. We butchered a steer last week, so there is fresh beef. We have chickens for eggs. The garden has been neglected, but there are still some vegetables. I can send someone into town for anything else you need." Violet turned to face him, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Then I can make you a proper supper tonight. Nothing fancy, but better than burnt beans." "That is all I ask?" He left her to settle in, saying he had work to attend to before evening. Violet stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, letting the reality of her new situation sink in. Free. She was free. The word felt strange and precious, like something fragile that might shatter if she examined it too closely. But she did not have time to stand around marveling at her luck. If she was going to cook supper for 6 hungry men, she needed to get started. Violet tied on an apron she found hanging on a hook, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She made an inventory of everything available, finding that Ashton had been truthful about the supplies. There was plenty to work with, just no organization or plan. She found potatoes in the root cellar, carrots that were starting to get soft but still usable, onions, and a few wrinkled apples. In the smokehouse hung the beef he had mentioned, along with some bacon and dried venison. The chickens, when she checked, had left her 6 fresh eggs. Violet decided on pot roast with vegetables, biscuits, and apple cobbler for dessert. It was simple, hearty food that would stick to the ribs of men who worked hard all day. She got a fire going in the stove, heated her Dutch oven, and began browning the beef with a competence born of years of practice. Her mother had taught her to cook before she could read, and it was as natural to her as breathing. As she worked, she found herself humming, something she had not done in months. The kitchen grew warm and fragrant with the smell of cooking meat and onions. She mixed biscuit dough with quick, efficient movements, rolled it out, cut perfect circles, and set them aside. The cobbler came together easily, the apples sweetened with a little sugar and cinnamon she found in the pantry. She was just sliding the biscuits into the oven when she heard voices outside. Through the window she could see men washing up at the pump, their faces and hands covered in the dust of a day's work. They moved toward the bunkhouse, probably to change clothes before supper. Violet checked her pots, adjusted the heat, and began setting the table. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when the men began filing into the house. Billy came first, followed by 4 others who stopped short when they saw the table laid out with actual plates and utensils instead of just tin cups and whatever was handy. Ashton came last, his hair damp as though he had dunked his head in the water trough. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Violet Morgan, our new cook," Ashton said. "Miss Morgan, these are my ranch hands. You have met Billy. That is Jake Martinez, Sam Peterson, Henry Walker, and Tom Crawford." Each man nodded or touched his hat as his name was called. They were a varied group, ranging in age from Billy, who could not have been more than 20, to Henry, who was graying at the temples. But they all had the same lean, weathered look of men who spent their lives outdoors doing physical labor. "Pleased to meet you all," Violet said. "Supper is ready if you want to sit down." They needed no second invitation. The men took their places at the table with barely concealed eagerness, and Violet began bringing out the food. She set the pot roast in the center, the meat so tender it was falling apart, surrounded by carrots and potatoes that had soaked up all the rich gravy. The basket of biscuits went next to it, steam still rising from the golden tops. She had churned some butter she found in the cold box and set that out as well. For a moment, the men just stared. Then Jake let out a low whistle. "Is that real food?" Tom asked, his voice full of wonder. "It is, unless you are all having the same hallucination," Violet said, taking her own seat at the end of the table opposite Ashton. "Should we say grace?" Henry asked, looking at Ashton. Ashton nodded, and they all bowed their heads. Henry spoke a simple prayer of thanksgiving, and then the meal began. Violet watched nervously as the men filled their plates and took their first bites. She had cooked for many people over the years, but somehow this felt different, more important. These men were depending on her, and she wanted to prove she was worth the risk Ashton had taken. The first bite seemed to render them all speechless. Then Billy closed his eyes and made a sound that was almost a groan. "Oh my God," he said. "This is amazing. This is the best pot roast I have ever had," Sam added, already reaching for seconds. "The biscuits are perfect," Jake said, slathering one with butter. "Light and fluffy." "Miss Morgan, if you decide to leave, I might have to tie you to the stove," Tom said, then immediately flushed red. "That came out wrong. I just meant that your cooking is really good." Despite her nervousness, Violet laughed. "I will take it as the compliment you intended." Ashton had not said anything yet, but when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He took another bite, chewed slowly, and then nodded. "This is excellent," he said simply. "Thank you, Miss Morgan." The praise, quiet and genuine, warmed her more than all the enthusiastic exclamations from the other men combined. They ate until the pot was scraped clean and every biscuit had vanished. Then Violet brought out the apple cobbler, and there was another round of amazed appreciation. By the time the meal was finished, the men were leaning back in their chairs with the satisfied expressions of people who had just experienced something wonderful. "Miss Morgan, I do not know what the boss is paying you, but it is not enough," Jake said. "I second that," Billy added. Ashton stood and began gathering plates. "Miss Morgan has had a long day. You all can clean up tonight." There were good-natured groans, but the men stood and began clearing the table without real complaint. Violet found herself ushered out of her own kitchen, Ashton's hand light on her elbow as he guided her toward the door. "You do not have to do this," she protested. "Cleaning up is part of the job. Tonight it is not. Go rest. Tomorrow you can establish whatever routine you want, but tonight you have done more than enough." She was too tired to argue. The long day, the emotional upheaval, the hard work of cooking, all of it crashed over her suddenly. She walked back to her cabin in the gathering dusk, the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Inside, she lit the lamp she found on the table and sank into one of the chairs. Free. She was free, and she had a job and a place to stay. And for the first time in 6 months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. It was fragile and strange, but it was there. Violet changed into her nightgown, washed her face in the basin on the stand, and climbed into the bed. The straw mattress rustled under her weight, and the blankets smelled of sage and sunshine. Through the window, she could see the lights of the main house, hear the faint sound of male voices and laughter. She fell asleep thinking about Ashton Nathaniel's storm cloud eyes and the way he had torn up her contract without hesitation. And she dreamed of mountains and wide-open skies and possibilities she had not dared to imagine in a very long time. The rooster woke her before dawn. Violet dressed quickly in the dim pre-morning light, pinning her hair up and splashing cold water on her face to chase away the last cobwebs of sleep. She hurried to the main house, wanting to have breakfast ready when the men came in from their morning chores. The kitchen was clean, she was pleased to note. The men had kept their word. She got the stove going and began pulling out supplies: bacon, eggs, potatoes for frying, flour for pancakes. Coffee was essential, so she put a large pot on to boil and ground the beans fresh. The kitchen filled with rich, enticing aromas as she worked. She was flipping pancakes when Ashton came in through the back door, carrying a bucket of fresh milk. He stopped when he saw her, as though he had not quite expected her to be there. "Good morning," Violet said. "I hope that milk is for breakfast." "It is." He set the bucket on the counter. "You are up early." "So are you. What time do your men usually start work?" "Sunrise or just before. We try to get as much done as possible before the heat of the day." "Then I timed it right. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. Ashton poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her work. It should have made her nervous, but somehow it did not. There was something companionable about his presence, undemanding but solid. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in months. That bed is more comfortable than it looks." "Good." He took a sip of coffee. "Listen, about today. I need to ride out to check on the north pasture, and I will probably be gone most of the day. If you need anything, Billy will be around. He is in charge when I'm not here. I will be fine. I have plenty to keep me busy organizing the kitchen properly." The other men began arriving, drawn by the smell of food. Breakfast was another success, with the men praising everything from the fluffy pancakes to the perfectly crispy bacon. Violet found herself relaxing into the rhythm of serving and clearing, accepting compliments with modest thanks. After the men dispersed to their various tasks, Violet rolled up her sleeves and began the serious work of organizing the kitchen to her standards. She scrubbed every surface, organized the pantry by type and frequency of use, made lists of supplies that needed replenishing, and generally took control of her new domain. By midday, she had transformed the space into something that made sense to her, where she could find what she needed without hunting. Dinner was beef stew with dumplings and fresh bread. The men ate with the same enthusiasm they had shown at breakfast and supper the night before, and Violet began to realize that feeding them well was going to be easier than she had thought. They were so grateful for decent food that they would probably have praised anything that was not burnt or raw. The days began to settle into a pattern. Violet woke before dawn, made breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, prepared dinner, had a few hours in the afternoon to herself, then made supper. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way her hotel job had never been. She had control over her space, respect from the men she cooked for, and the freedom to make her own decisions about menus and methods. Ashton was often gone during the day, managing the various aspects of the ranch. But he always came back for meals. Violet found herself watching for him, noticing the way he moved with economical grace, the way he listened carefully when his men spoke, the quiet authority he carried that had nothing to do with bluster or show. He was patient and fair, quick to praise good work, and equally quick to pitch in when something needed doing. His men respected him, that much was clear, and so did she. A week after her arrival, Ashton asked if she wanted to ride into town for supplies. She accepted, both because she genuinely needed a few things, and because she was curious to see how the people of Knight's Ferry would react to her new situation. They rode together on his horse again, Violet growing more comfortable with the arrangement, though she still kept her hands on the saddle rim rather than his waist. The town was busy with mid-morning activity. Ashton tied his horse outside the general store and escorted her inside, where the proprietor, an older man named Mr. Chen, greeted them with polite curiosity. "Good morning, Mr. Nathaniel, Miss Morgan. What can I help you find today?" Violet presented her list, and Mr. Chen began gathering items. As he worked, several other townspeople came in and out, their eyes flicking to Violet with speculation. She held her head high, refusing to show any discomfort. Let them wonder. She had nothing to be ashamed of. They were almost finished when a woman in an elegant blue dress swept into the store, followed by a younger woman who was probably her daughter. The older woman's eyes landed on Violet and narrowed. "Ashton Nathaniel," she said, her voice carrying clearly. I heard you bought yourself a woman at auction. I did not believe it until now." Ashton's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Mrs. Bradford, Miss Bradford, I hired a cook for the ranch. Miss Morgan is an employee, not a possession." "I am sure," Mrs. Bradford said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It is all very proper, I am certain. A young woman living on a ranch with 6 men and no chaperone. The very picture of respectability." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Ashton stepped forward slightly, putting himself between her and Mrs. Bradford. "Miss Morgan lives in her own cabin and is treated with complete respect by everyone on my ranch. If you have questions about my hiring practices, you can address them to me privately. Otherwise, I would thank you not to spread gossip about things you know nothing about. Mrs. Bradford's face flushed. "Well, I was merely expressing concern." "Your concern is noted. Good day, Mrs. Bradford." It was a clear dismissal. Mrs. Bradford huffed, gathered her skirts, and swept out with her daughter trailing behind. Mr. Chen finished tallying their purchases with an apologetic smile. "Do not mind Mrs. Bradford," he said quietly. "She thinks running the church social committee makes her the moral authority of the town. Most people know better." Ashton paid for the supplies, and they loaded everything into the saddlebags. Before they left town, he stopped at the small restaurant attached to the hotel and ordered them both lunch. They sat at a corner table, and Violet finally allowed herself to relax slightly. "I am sorry about that," Ashton said. "Mrs. Bradford is a difficult woman at the best of times." "You do not need to apologize. I knew there would be talk. That does not make it right." He cut into his roast chicken with more force than necessary. "You are doing honest work and should not have to deal with small-minded gossip." Violet studied him across the table. "Why does it bother you so much? What people think, I mean." He was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "I suppose because I know what it is like to be judged unfairly. My father was a drunk who gambled away everything we had. When he died, he left nothing but debts. I was 16, and people assumed I would end up just like him. Some of them still look at me and see him instead of me. It made me determined to prove them wrong, to build something solid and good. But it also made me aware of how quick people are to judge without knowing the full story. Is that why you helped me? Because you know what it is like to be judged?" "Partly. Also because it was the right thing to do, and I was in a position to do it." He met her eyes. "I do not regret it, if that is what you are asking. Best $500 I ever spent." Violet felt warmth spread through her chest. "Even if my cooking had been terrible? Even then, though I am very glad it is not." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, the saddlebags heavy with supplies. As they approached, Violet could see storm clouds gathering over the mountains to the east, dark and heavy with rain. The air had that electric feeling that came before a storm, and the wind was picking up. "Looks like we are in for some weather," Ashton said. "The cabin roof is solid, so you should be fine. But if the wind gets too bad, come to the main house." That night, the storm broke with dramatic force. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the ground. Rain drummed on the roof of Violet's cabin like 1,000 desperate fingers, and the wind howled around the corners. She lay in bed, watching the lightning illuminate her window in brief, stark flashes, feeling oddly safe despite the fury of the storm. In the morning, the world was washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, and everything seemed to sparkle in the fresh sunlight. But the storm had also brought damage. A large branch had fallen on the chicken coop, crushing part of the roof, and several fence posts had blown over in the north pasture. All hands were needed for repairs, which meant the men would be working through dinner instead of stopping to eat. Violet packed them a cold lunch of sandwiches and apples, which Billy came to collect around noon. "Thanks, Miss Morgan. We should be done by supper time, though." She spent the afternoon making a special meal to reward their hard work. A roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh green beans she had found in the neglected garden, and a rhubarb pie for dessert. She even made fresh bread, the kind that required kneading and rising time, because she had the hours to spare. The men came in tired and dirty as the sun was setting. They cleaned up quickly and sat down to eat with groans of appreciation. The meal was consumed with even more enthusiasm than usual, and Violet felt a deep satisfaction in seeing them well-fed and content. After the others had left, Ashton stayed behind to help with the dishes. Violet protested, but he ignored her, rolling up his sleeves and taking his place at the sink. "You made enough food to feed twice as many people," he said. "The least I can do is help clean up." They worked in companionable silence for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. Violet washed, Ashton dried, and put away. The kitchen was warm and quiet, lit by the soft glow of the lamps now that darkness had fallen outside. "Can I ask you something?" Ashton said suddenly. "Of course." "What brought you to California in the first place? You said you were from Pennsylvania." Violet was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling in the warm dishwater. "My mother died 2 years ago. She was all the family I had left. My father died when I was young, and there were never any siblings. After she passed, I tried to keep the boarding house going, but I could not manage it alone. I had to sell it, and the money I got barely covered her medical debts. A woman came through town, recruiting workers for the hotels in California, said there was good money to be made and opportunities for advancement. It sounded better than staying in Pennsylvania with nothing but memories. But it did not work out that way. No. The hotel owner was kind enough, but he was old and sick, and when he died, everything fell apart. His widow had no interest in running a hotel, and the creditors descended like vultures. We all had these contracts that seemed reasonable when we signed them, but they included all these clauses about assuming employer debts if the business failed. Most of us had no family, no one to turn to. The widow could have fought for us, but she just wanted to wash her hands of the whole thing. So, we ended up at auction. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on her apron. "Your turn. How did you end up with a ranch?" Ashton hung up the dish towel carefully. "After my father died, I worked any job I could find. Farms, mines, construction, anything that paid. I saved every penny. When I was 21, I had enough to buy a small piece of land and a few head of cattle. I built the first cabin myself, just one room, and lived there while I built up the herd. Every year I bought a little more land, hired a hand or two when I could afford it, and kept building. It has been 7 years now, and the ranch is doing well enough that I do not have to worry about next month's expenses. Not rich, but stable. Solid. You built all this by yourself. With help. I could not have done it alone, but yes, essentially I started with nothing and made something." Violet looked at him in the lamplight, seeing the pride in his face, the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something difficult through sheer determination and hard work. "That is impressive. It is necessary. I never wanted to be in the position my mother was in when my father died. Left with nothing and dependent on the charity of people who mostly just wanted to feel superior. I wanted security for myself and eventually for a family if I ever have one." "Do you think about that, having a family?" He met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "More lately than I used to." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Ashton stepped back, breaking the spell. "It is late. I should let you get some rest." Violet nodded, suddenly unable to find words. He wished her good night and left, and she stood alone in the kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should, wondering what had just happened and what it might mean. The days continued to pass, late September giving way to October. The heat of summer faded into the cooler temperatures of autumn, and the hills around the ranch turned even more golden as the grass dried. Violet fell fully into her role, becoming indispensable to the daily life of the ranch. The men depended on her for more than just meals. She mended their clothes, tended small injuries with the medicine kit in the kitchen, listened to their stories and concerns. But it was Ashton who occupied more and more of her thoughts. She found herself watching for him during the day, noting the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the rare smiles that transformed his usually serious face. He began spending more time in the kitchen after the other men had left, helping with dishes or just sitting at the table drinking coffee and talking to her about everything and nothing. They discussed books they had read, places they had been, dreams they had for the future. He told her about his sister, who lived in Oregon now, with her husband and 2 children. She told him about her mother's boarding house, the regular guests who had become like family. One evening in mid-October, as they were cleaning up after supper, Ashton set down the plate he was drying and turned to face her directly. "Violet, can I ask you something?" She noticed he had started using her first name a few weeks ago, and she had not corrected him. She liked the way it sounded in his voice. "Of course. Are you happy here? Truly happy, not just making the best of things?" The question surprised her. Yes, I am happy. Why do you ask? Because you have been here almost 2 months now, and I realized I never checked. I gave you the choice to stay, but I never asked if you were glad you made that choice. Violet dried her hands and faced him fully. I am glad. This is the first time in a long time that I have felt like I belonged somewhere. The work is hard, but it is satisfying. The men are respectful. And you... She trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence. And I what? His voice was quiet, but his eyes were intent on her face. You have been kind, more than kind. You gave me back my freedom, and then you gave me a place where I could use that freedom to build something. I will always be grateful for that. I do not want your gratitude. He took a step closer. I want you to be happy. Not because you feel you owe me something, but because you choose to be here. I do choose it. Her heart was pounding now. Every day I choose it. Good. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek for just a moment before he dropped his hand. That is good. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, the space between them charged with all the things they were not quite saying yet. Then Ashton stepped back, the moment passing but not forgotten. Good night, Violet. Good night, Ashton. After that night, something shifted between them. The glances they exchanged grew longer, more meaningful. When they worked side by side in the kitchen, they moved in harmony, anticipating each other's needs without words. Sometimes their hands would brush, brief contacts that sent sparks up Violet's arm and made her breath catch. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Billy started grinning whenever he saw them together. Jake made not-so-subtle comments about what a good team they made. Even Tom, the shyest of the bunch, smiled knowingly when he caught them standing close together. November arrived with cooler temperatures and the first real threat of winter. The cattle needed to be moved to lower pastures, firewood needed to be split and stacked, and 100 other tasks required attention before the weather turned truly cold. Ashton worked long hours, often coming in exhausted after dark. One night, he came in so late that the other men had already eaten and gone to the bunkhouse. Violet had kept a plate warm for him, and she served it as he sank into a chair at the kitchen table. You work too hard, she said, pouring him coffee. Says the woman who gets up before dawn every day to make sure everyone is fed. But he smiled as he said it, the tiredness in his face easing slightly. This is delicious. Thank you. She sat down across from him, cradling her own cup of tea. Tell me about your day. So he did, talking about stubborn cattle and broken equipment, and a dozen small dramas that made up ranch life. She listened, asking questions, laughing at his dry observations about the cow's apparent conspiracy to make his life difficult. When he finished eating, she brought out a piece of apple pie she had saved for him, and he closed his eyes in appreciation at the first bite. Violet, I have to tell you something. Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. What is it? I have been thinking about this for weeks now, and I cannot keep it to myself anymore. He set down his fork and looked at her directly. I have feelings for you. Deep feelings. I know it has only been a few months, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed to tell you. You should know that when I look at you, I see someone I could spend the rest of my life with. Someone I want to spend the rest of my life with. Violet's heart seemed to stop and then start again, racing. Ashton, you do not have to say anything right now. I just wanted you to know, and I want you to know that, regardless of how you feel, your job here is secure. You do not have to worry about that. But if there is any chance that you might feel the same way, I would like to know. She stood up, and he did too, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Violet walked around the table until she was standing right in front of him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I do feel the same way, she said softly. I have been falling in love with you since the day you tore up my contract and gave me back my freedom, maybe even before that, when you stood in front of Mrs. Bradford and defended me. You are a good man, Ashton Nathaniel, the best man I have ever known. And yes, I want to spend my life with you too. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. Really? Really. He cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm and calloused against her skin. May I kiss you? Yes. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, and brushed his lips against hers. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then Violet's arms went around his neck, and he pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made her feel like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ashton rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for so long," he said. "Why did you wait?" "Because I wanted you to be sure. I wanted you to know you had a choice, that you were not trapped or obligated. Your freedom was the first gift I gave you, and I would never take it back." Violet felt tears prick her eyes. "That is why I love you, because you see me as a person, not a possession. Because you respect me enough to let me choose." "And you choose me?" "I choose you. I choose this. I choose us." He kissed her again, longer this time, and when they finally separated, both of them were grinning like fools. They stood in the kitchen holding hands, talking about the future in excited whispers, making plans and promises. Ashton wanted to marry her, properly, with the circuit preacher who came through once a month. Violet wanted that too, wanted to bind her life to his in every way possible. "What will people say?" she asked, thinking of Mrs. Bradford and her ilk. "I do not care what they say. Let them talk. We will know the truth, and so will everyone who matters." He squeezed her hands. "Besides, I have a feeling, once we are married, and you are the respectable Mrs. Nathaniel, they will change their tune quickly enough. People like Mrs. Bradford are only interested in appearing moral, not actually being so." They agreed to wait a few weeks before announcing their engagement, wanting to savor the privacy of their new understanding before sharing it with the world. But it was hard to hide their feelings. The ranch hands noticed immediately the next morning the way Ashton and Violet looked at each other, the smiles that seemed to come more easily to both their faces. Billy cornered Violet in the kitchen after breakfast. "So, you and the boss?" She blushed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes, and I'm happy for you both. He has been different since you came, lighter somehow. And you seem happy too." "I am, happier than I ever thought I could be." "Good, you both deserve it." The news spread through the small ranch community quickly, and by evening, all the men knew. They were unanimously supportive, congratulating Ashton and treating Violet with even more respect than before. That night at supper, Jake raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To the boss and Miss Morgan, may they have many years of happiness together. And may Miss Morgan never stop cooking," Tom added, which made everyone laugh. The circuit preacher was due to come through Knight's Ferry the second week of December. Ashton sent word that they would need him to perform a wedding, and the preacher sent back his congratulations and confirmation. That gave them a month to prepare, which was not much time, but felt like an eternity to Violet, who had never imagined she would be planning her own wedding. She had no family to invite, but Ashton wrote to his sister in Oregon, hoping she might be able to make the journey despite the distance and the season. He also insisted on taking Violet into Sacramento to buy her a proper wedding dress, something she protested was too extravagant. "It is not extravagant," he said firmly. "It is your wedding day. You should have a dress that makes you feel beautiful." "I do not need an expensive dress for that. I feel beautiful when you look at me." He pulled her into his arms, there in the kitchen, where they had spent so many hours together. "You are beautiful, the most beautiful woman I have ever known, inside and out. But I still want to buy you a dress. Please." How could she argue with that? So, they made the trip to Sacramento, a 2-day journey by stagecoach. Ashton arranged for Billy to be in charge of the ranch while they were gone, and they set off on a crisp November morning, with Violet feeling like she was embarking on an adventure. Sacramento was bigger than anything Violet had seen since leaving Pennsylvania. The streets were crowded with people, horses, and wagons, and buildings rose 2 and 3 stories high. Ashton took her to a respectable hotel where they got separate rooms, always proper, even though they were engaged. Then he escorted her to a dress shop on a tree-lined street where a capable-looking woman named Mrs. Hartley greeted them. "We need a wedding dress," Ashton said. "Something beautiful and well-made. Money is not a concern." "Mrs." Hartley sized up Violet with an experienced eye. "I have several ready-made dresses that might work, but I could also create something custom if you have the time." "We have 2 weeks," Violet said. "Will that be enough?" "More than enough. Come with me, dear, and let us see what we can do." What followed was one of the most surreal experiences of Violet's life. Mrs. Hartley brought out bolt after bolt of fabric, discussing colors and styles and silhouettes with the confidence of an expert. Ashton sat in a corner chair, offering opinions when asked, but mostly just watching Violet with an expression of such tenderness that she kept having to look away for fear she might cry. They eventually settled on a dress of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, simple but elegant, with a fitted bodice and full skirt. Mrs. Hartley took Violet's measurements and promised to have it ready within 10 days. Ashton paid a deposit without flinching at the cost, and they left the shop with Violet feeling dazed. "That was too much," she said as they walked down the street. "It was perfect, and worth every penny to see the look on your face when you saw yourself in the mirror." They spent the rest of the day exploring the city. Ashton bought her a pair of fine leather boots that actually fit properly, a warm winter cloak, and a locket on a gold chain that he fastened around her neck himself. They ate dinner at a restaurant where the food was fancy, but not nearly as good as Violet's cooking, which made Ashton declare loudly enough for the waiter to hear. They walked along the river as the sun set, and Ashton told her about the first time he had come to Sacramento, desperate and 16 and determined to make something of himself. "I stood right here," he said, pointing to a spot near the water, "and I made a promise that I would not fail, that I would build something lasting and good, that I would be better than my father." "You kept that promise," Violet said, lacing her fingers through his. "I did, and now I get to keep a new promise, to you, to love you and provide for you and make you happy for as long as I live. You already make me happy every single day." They returned to the hotel as full darkness fell. Ashton walked her to her room, kissed her goodnight at the door with a tenderness that made her knees weak, and forced himself to walk away to his own room. Violet closed the door and leaned against it, her heart full to bursting. In just a few weeks, she would be his wife. The thought was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. They collected the dress 10 days later, and it was even more beautiful than Violet had remembered. Mrs. Hartley had added tiny seed pearls to the lace, and the fit was perfect. Ashton was not allowed to see it on her wedding tradition, but his eyes lit up when he saw the wrapped package. The journey back to Knight's Ferry seemed shorter than the journey out. Violet clutched the dress box on her lap the entire way, still not quite believing any of this was real. But the weight of the locket around her neck and the ring Ashton had quietly slipped onto her left hand in Sacramento reminded her that it was real, all of it. When they arrived back at the ranch, they found a letter waiting from Ashton's sister. She and her husband would be making the journey for the wedding, bringing their 2 children with them. Ashton read the letter aloud to Violet, his voice thick with emotion. "She is coming. I have not seen Rachel in 2 years, and she will get to meet you." "What if she does not like me?" Violet asked, suddenly nervous. "She will love you. How could she not?" The week before the wedding was a flurry of activity. The ranch hands decorated the main house with pine boughs and whatever flowers could still be found blooming in December. Jake proved to have an unexpected talent for carpentry and built a beautiful wooden arch that would serve as the altar. Tom rode into town and invited every respectable family, determined that Violet would have a proper wedding with witnesses. Rachel and her family arrived 3 days before the ceremony. She was a tall woman with Ashton's dark hair and intelligent eyes, and she swept Violet into a hug the moment they were introduced. "Thank you," she whispered in Violet's ear. "Thank you for making my brother happy. I have never seen him like this." Rachel's husband, David, was a quiet man with a kind smile, and their 2 children, a boy of 5 and a girl of 3, brought chaos and laughter to the ranch. Ashton was transformed around them, playing with the children and joking with his sister in a way Violet had never seen. It gave her a glimpse of what he might be like as a father someday, and the image made her heart ache with longing. The night before the wedding, Rachel helped Violet prepare. They were in Violet's cabin, the dress hanging carefully on a hook, the boots polished to a shine. "Are you nervous?" Rachel asked, brushing out Violet's long auburn hair. "A little. Not about marrying Ashton, but about everything else. What if I am not a good wife? What if I disappoint him?" Rachel's hands stilled. "Do you love him?" "More than anything." "Then you will not disappoint him. Love is the foundation. Everything else you can learn together." She resumed brushing. "Ashton told me how you met, how he bought your freedom. He did not have to do that. He could have just hired me after. But he did not. He freed you first, gave you the choice. That is who my brother is. Our father was a selfish, cruel man who only ever thought about himself. Ashton was determined to be different. He has spent his whole life trying to be the opposite of our father in every way." When he loves someone, he loves completely, without reservation or condition. You are a very lucky woman. I know, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure he knows how much I appreciate him. Rachel smiled. I think you two are going to be very happy together. The wedding day dawned clear and cold. Violet woke early, too excited and nervous to sleep. Rachel came to help her dress, and together they transformed her from ranch cook to bride. The ivory silk dress fit like a dream, the lace catching the morning light. Rachel arranged Violet's hair in an elaborate style, weaving in small white flowers that Billy had somehow managed to find. The locket Ashton had given her gleamed at her throat. When Violet looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy, radiant, loved. All the hardship and sorrow of the past years seemed to have faded, leaving only joy. The ceremony was set for noon. Rachel and the children went ahead to the main house, leaving Violet alone for a few minutes to compose herself. She stood in her cabin, taking slow breaths, reminding herself that this was real, this was happening, this was her life now. A knock on the door made her turn. Come in. Billy stepped inside, dressed in his best clothes with his hair slicked back. Miss Morgan, I'm supposed to escort you to the house. If you are ready? I am ready. He offered his arm, and she took it. They walked together across the yard, which had been transformed. Someone had strung rope between posts and hung lanterns and pine boughs, creating a path to the main house. People were gathered on the porch and in the yard, more than Violet had expected. Families from neighboring ranches, townspeople from Knight's Ferry, even Mr. Chen from the general store. They all turned to watch as she approached, and she heard murmurs of appreciation. But Violet only had eyes for Ashton. He stood under the wooden arch Jake had built, wearing a black suit she had never seen before, looking so handsome it made her heart skip. When their eyes met, his face transformed into a smile so full of love and wonder that Violet felt tears prick her eyes. Billy escorted her to the arch and placed her hand in Ashton's, then stepped back. The circuit preacher, an elderly man with a white beard, opened his Bible. The ceremony was simple and beautiful. They spoke their vows in clear, firm voices, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they lived. Ashton slipped a gold band on her finger to match the engagement ring, and she did the same for him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ashton cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with all the pent-up passion of the weeks they had been waiting. The gathered crowd cheered and applauded. The reception was a joyous affair. Tables had been set up outside, groaning with food that Violet had spent days preparing with Rachel's help. There was roasted beef and venison, vegetables from the root cellar, fresh bread and butter, pies and cakes and cookies. The ranch hands had somehow procured several bottles of wine and whiskey, and toasts were offered to the happy couple. Music was provided by a fiddler from town, and there was dancing on the porch as the afternoon wore on. Violet danced with Ashton, with Billy, with Jake, with Ashton's brother-in-law, David. But always her eyes returned to her husband, and always she found him watching her with that same look of wonder, as though he could not quite believe his luck. As evening fell and the guests began to depart, Ashton pulled Violet aside. Are you happy? Happier than I ever imagined I could be. Good, because I have one more surprise for you. He led her to the main house, to a room she had not spent much time in. It was the master bedroom, and it had been completely transformed. Someone had brought in a new bed, larger and more comfortable looking than her narrow one in the cabin. The quilt was new, a beautiful pattern in shades of blue and cream. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and a fire crackled in the small fireplace. I wanted you to have something new, Ashton said. Something that was ours, not just mine. If you want, we can change anything you do not like. Violet turned to him, this man who had given her freedom and love, and now a home. It is perfect. Everything is perfect. He pulled her into his arms, and this time when he kissed her, there was no crowd to cheer, no need to hold back. This kiss was deep and passionate and full of promise. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Ashton swept her into his arms and carried her across the threshold of their bedroom, kicking the door shut behind them. The months that followed were the happiest of Violet's life. She settled fully into her role as Ashton's wife, managing not just the kitchen, but the entire household. The cabin that had been hers became a guest room, and she moved all her belongings into the main house, into the bedroom she shared with her husband. Waking up next to him every morning felt like a gift she never took for granted. Rachel and her family stayed through Christmas, and the holiday was magical. Violet cooked a feast, and they exchanged small gifts and told stories and played games with the children. On Christmas night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ashton and Violet sat by the fire in their bedroom, wrapped in each other's arms. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being you, for choosing me, for making this house feel like a home. You made it a home first by filling it with kindness and respect. I just added some decent cooking." He laughed and kissed the top of her head. "You added so much more than that." In February, Violet began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Ashton, wanting to be sure. When she finally shared the news with him one evening after supper, he went very still. "A baby?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, in late summer, I think." He stood up slowly, pulling her to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We are going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby," she confirmed, and felt him shaking slightly, overwhelmed with emotion. "I am going to be a father. You are going to be a wonderful father." He pulled back to look at her face, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I want to be better than my father was. I want our children to grow up knowing they are loved and valued and safe. They will. I promise you they will." The pregnancy was easy, much to Violet's relief. She continued cooking for the ranch, though Ashton fussed over her constantly, trying to get her to rest more. The men were all thrilled about the baby, treating Violet with even more care than before. Billy started making a cradle in his spare time, working on it secretively in the barn. Jake whittled small wooden toys. Tom, despite his shyness, offered to help however he could. Rachel and David sent a letter full of congratulations and advice, promising to visit once the baby arrived. Ashton began making plans to expand the house, adding another bedroom for the nursery, determined that everything would be ready when their child arrived. On a hot August evening, Violet went into labor. Ashton rode frantically to town to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Patterson, who arrived calm and competent. The birth was long and difficult, but Violet endured it with gritted teeth and determination, squeezing Ashton's hand so hard she left marks. Finally, as dawn was breaking, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that made everyone in the room smile. "A boy," Mrs. Patterson announced, placing the baby in Violet's arms. "A fine, healthy boy." Violet looked down at her son, this tiny, perfect person she and Ashton had created, and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. He had dark hair like his father, and eyes that were still newborn blue, but might eventually turn green like hers. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Ashton sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Violet, staring at their son with an expression of absolute awe. "He is perfect. What should we name him?" Violet asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Ashton smiled. "What about Benjamin? It means son of my right hand in Hebrew. It seems fitting." "Benjamin Nathaniel," Violet tested the name. "I love it." They named him Benjamin David Nathaniel, the middle name honoring Ashton's brother-in-law, who had become a good friend. The ranch hands were allowed to visit that afternoon, each of them gazing at the baby with wonder and offering awkward but heartfelt congratulations. Billy presented the cradle he had been working on, beautifully crafted and polished smooth. It was placed next to the bed, and Benjamin slept in it that night while Violet recovered and Ashton stayed by her side, unable to stop watching over both of them. The months that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Benjamin was a good baby, sleeping reasonably well and eating enthusiastically. Violet learned to balance motherhood with her other responsibilities, often cooking with the baby strapped to her chest in a carrier Ashton had fashioned. The men all became unofficial uncles, happy to hold Benjamin or make funny faces to earn his gummy smiles. When Benjamin was 6 months old, Rachel and her family came to visit again. Rachel's children were delighted with their new cousin, gentle and sweet with the baby. The two sisters-in-law sat together while the babies napped, and Rachel smiled at Violet. "You look happy. Tired, but happy." "I am. Some days I have to pinch myself to believe this is really my life." "Ashton looks happy too, happier than I have ever seen him. You are good for each other." "He saved me, you know, not just from the auction, but from a life where I had stopped believing good things could happen. He gave me hope when I had none left." Rachel squeezed her hand. "And you gave him something to believe in besides just surviving. You gave him a future worth building. As the years passed, the ranch continued to prosper. Ashton expanded the operation, buying more land and increasing the herd. He built the addition to the house, creating space for their growing family. When Benjamin was 2, Violet gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose, who had Violet's auburn hair and Ashton's blue-gray eyes. 2 years after that came another son, Matthew James, who was quieter than his siblings, but just as loved. Violet learned to manage a household full of children, ranch hands, and the various demands of being a rancher's wife. She organized community gatherings, helped neighbors in need, and earned the respect of even the most skeptical townspeople. Mrs. Bradford, faced with Violet's obvious respectability and happiness, eventually stopped her gossip and even began treating her with grudging politeness. The children grew up running wild on the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with age-appropriate chores, and listening to their mother's stories as she cooked in the kitchen that had become the heart of the home. They learned that their father had saved their mother when she needed saving, and that love could transform lives if you were brave enough to risk it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ashton took Violet back to Sacramento for a few days, leaving the children with Billy and the other hands who had become extended family. They stayed in the same hotel where they had stayed before their wedding, and Ashton took her to the finest restaurant in the city. 10 years, he said, raising his glass in a toast. 10 years since I made the best decision of my life. Buying me at auction, Violet teased, freeing you, and then being fortunate enough that you chose to stay. I would choose you 1,000 times over. In any life, in any circumstance, I would always choose you. They clinked glasses and drank, and then Violet reached into her reticule and pulled out a small wrapped package. I have something for you. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind Ashton had once mentioned wanting but never buying for himself. On the first page, Violet had written, "To my husband, Ashton Nathaniel, thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for freeing me when I was trapped, and for loving me when I had forgotten how to love myself. You are my home, my heart, my everything. All my love, always. Violet." Ashton read it, his throat working with emotion. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with tears he did not bother to hide. "I love you," he said simply, "more than words can ever express." "Then show me," Violet said, standing and extending her hand. He took it, and they went upstairs to their room, closing the door on the world outside. They returned to the ranch 3 days later to find everything running smoothly. Benjamin, now 12, had taken charge of his younger siblings with the seriousness of an oldest child. Sarah and Matthew had helped with cooking and cleaning, and the ranch hands reported that the children had been well-behaved and helpful. "We managed fine," Benjamin said proudly. "But we are glad you are back." Life continued in its pleasant rhythm. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and interests. Benjamin showed an aptitude for ranching and spent all his free time working alongside his father. Sarah loved cooking and helped her mother in the kitchen, learning recipes and techniques with the same dedication Violet had shown at her age. Matthew was the dreamer, always reading or drawing, but he worked hard when asked and had a gentle way with the animals that impressed everyone. When Benjamin turned 18, Ashton began officially training him to eventually take over the ranch. It was not a matter of pushing responsibility onto his son, but rather recognizing that Benjamin had the skills and passion for the work. Father and son spent long days together, riding the property, making decisions, planning for the future. One evening, as Violet and Ashton sat on the porch watching the sunset, their children grown and independent but still living at home, Ashton took her hand. "We did well," he said quietly. "We did. 3 wonderful children, a successful ranch, a good life. None of it would have happened without you. Do you ever think about that day at the auction, how different everything might have been?" Violet was quiet for a moment, remembering the fear and uncertainty, the humiliation and despair. Then she thought about everything that had come after: freedom, love, family, purpose. "Sometimes, but mostly I think about how grateful I am that you were there, that you saw past what everyone else saw, and gave me a chance to be more than just a cook being sold to the highest bidder. You were never just a cook. From the moment I saw you on that platform, holding your head high despite everything, I knew you were something special. And you were the cowboy who bought my freedom and asked me to stay. The best decision I ever made was saying yes." They sat together as darkness fell, the lights of the house warm behind them, the sounds of their children's laughter drifting out through the open windows. The land stretched out before them, golden and beautiful, full of memories and promises kept. Years later, when their children had children of their own and the ranch had been passed to Benjamin's capable hands, Violet and Ashton still lived in the main house. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their movements slower, but the love between them had only deepened with time. They would sit on the porch on warm evenings, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The children would run to them for stories, and Violet would tell them about the day she met their grandfather, about the auction and the torn contract and the choice she made to stay. "Was it scary?" one of the grandchildren asked once. "Very scary," Violet admitted. "But sometimes the scariest decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes. Your grandfather gave me the courage to take that risk, to believe in possibility again." Ashton squeezed her hand. "And you gave me a reason to be more than just a man surviving. You gave me a family, a purpose, a life worth living." They lived to see Benjamin marry a sweet young woman named Catherine, watch Sarah fall in love with a teacher from town, and celebrated when Matthew opened a bookstore in Sacramento. They became great-grandparents, their legacy spreading through the generations. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was filled with people, 3 generations laughing and talking and sharing stories. A photographer came from Sacramento and took a formal portrait of Violet and Ashton, their children arranged around them, grandchildren clustered at their feet. That night, after everyone had finally gone to bed, Violet and Ashton walked out to the spot where he had proposed so many years ago. The moon was full, silvering the landscape, and the air was warm with late summer. 50 years, Violet said, leaning into his side. "Can you believe it? Some days it feels like 50 minutes. Other days it feels like we have always been together, like there was never a time when we were not us. I would do it all again, every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it, just to end up here with you." Ashton turned to face her, cupping her face in his hands the way he had on their wedding day. His hands were more weathered now, marked by decades of hard work, but his touch was just as gentle. "You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and I still fall in love with you a little more every day. Even with the gray hair and wrinkles," she teased. "Especially with the gray hair and wrinkles. They are proof of the life we have built together, the years we have shared. Every line on your face tells a story, and I know all of them by heart." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 50 years of love and devotion and partnership. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. They walked back to the house hand in hand, secure in the knowledge that they had created something lasting. The ranch would continue through their children and grandchildren. The love they shared would echo through generations, a testament to the power of seeing someone truly, of offering freedom instead of chains, of choosing compassion over self-interest. Violet Morgan Nathaniel, once sold at auction for her cooking skills, had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. And it had all started with a cowboy who bought her freedom and asked her to stay, then waited patiently for her to choose him back. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her, and together they had created something beautiful and enduring. As they settled into bed that night, Ashton pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you for staying." "Thank you for asking," she whispered back. And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 50 years, Violet thought about the scared young woman on that auction platform and wished she could tell her that everything would be all right. That freedom was waiting just around the corner, held in the hands of a cowboy with storm cloud eyes and a heart big enough to see her worth when the world had tried to reduce her to a price tag. But that young woman had found her way to this moment through courage and hope and the willingness to take a risk on love. And that, Violet thought as sleep claimed her, was the greatest triumph of all. The story of Ashton and Violet became a legend in Knight's Ferry, told and retold by those who knew them. It was a story about second chances and the transformative power of love, about a man who gave freedom as a gift, and a woman who chose to stay not out of obligation, but out of love. It was proof that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best ones, if we are brave enough to believe in possibility and wise enough to choose love when it is offered. And in the end, that was the legacy they left behind. Not just a successful ranch or a large family, but a story of hope that reminded everyone who heard it that even in the darkest times, there is always the possibility of light. You just have to be willing to reach for it, to risk believing that tomorrow can be better than today, to trust that sometimes strangers become saviors and auctions become the first chapter of a love story that spans a lifetime. Violet and Ashton's story continued to be told long after they were gone, passed down through their descendants and shared with anyone who would listen. It became a reminder that love is always a choice, that freedom is the greatest gift one person can give another, and that the most beautiful lives are built on foundations of mutual respect, trust, and genuine partnership. In the Golden Hills of California, where the Stanislaus River still runs through Knight's Ferry and the ranch still stands as testament to one man's determination and one woman's courage, their story lives on. It lives in the land they work together, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carry their legacy forward, in the very walls of the house where they built their life together. And if you listen carefully on warm summer evenings when the wind whispers through the golden grass, you might almost hear it, the echo of their laughter, the sound of her humming as she cooks, his voice calling her name with all the love and devotion of a lifetime. Because some love stories are so powerful, so true, that they never really end. They just become part of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the place where they unfolded. This was one of those stories, and it all began with a woman sold at auction for her cooking skills, a cowboy who bought her freedom, and a simple question that changed both their lives forever. Will you stay? She said yes, and in that yes was contained every moment of joy, every challenge overcome, every dream realized that would follow. It was the yes that built a family, that created a home, that proved love could triumph over circumstance and transform lives in ways neither of them could have imagined, standing in that dusty town square on a September day in 1867. The story of Violet and Ashton was proof that fairy tales can come true even in the hardest of times, in the roughest of places, if you are willing to believe in the possibility of love and brave enough to choose it when it chooses you back. And for 50 beautiful years, they chose each other every single day, building a life that became the foundation for generations to come, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward in the hearts and memories of everyone whose lives they touched.